Right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar, where we'll be talking about the differences between a UK bond and a Portuguese investment bond. So the focus of today's webinar is purely on the bonds, to provide a little bit of information and background on these. But both in the UK and Portugal, they are not the only product, and it's important to consider all the options that are available for you. So if you are in the position where you are looking at the bond or other products, please reach out to us. Let's have a conversation, and we would like to work with you and assess what the best options are for you. Today's webinar is focused on the bonds, but we have many more webinars we produced for expats out there on relocating, visas, taxation, everything that you need to know. So please visit our YouTube channel, Fiduciary Wealth, or you might even be watching us on that now. If so, please subscribe, as there's much more content on its way, which includes our Money and Finance for Expats podcast. This is a weekly show, 10 a.m. UK time. They'll be live streamed on Facebook or YouTube, or you can watch the recordings after on YouTube, listen via Spotify or anywhere else that you may receive your podcast content. So subscribe to our YouTube channel, and you can get access to all that information for free. So yeah, today's webinar should be a relatively quick one. We're going to cover the UK bond, then the Portuguese bond, end with a bit more information at the end. When shouldn't you use a Portuguese bond? A few frequently asked questions and some final advice. And at the end, for those joining us live, we are welcome to take your questions at the end. Please use the Zoom function to be able to do that. So before we start with the content, quick introduction for those who haven't spoken to us before. So my name is Matt Penfold, advisor and director at Fiduciary Wealth. I've been working in financial services for 20 years now, having spent the last 4 years working in Gibraltar, but living in Spain, having relocated from the UK. Also here is Paul Correa. Paul is our managing director and co-founder of Fiduciary Wealth. Paul has extensive years of experience in financial services, strong private banking background and wealth management as well. And in 2007, he co-founded Fiduciary Wealth, partnering with Isola's 1892, the oldest law firm in Gibraltar. So aside from our legal roots, Fiduciary Wealth is a member of MGI Worldwide, a top 20 global network of accountants and tax advisors. And our philosophy, or our mission and our values are very simple. We want to give impartial, quality advice to offer solutions for those issues that expats may have, and we know from a lot of experience dealing with people in this situation that it can be a complicated process, and we're here to work with you side by side to make your relocation or your life abroad or even in the UK as comfortable as possible. So we will kick off, and Portugal. Sorry, Paul. Not Paul. Portugal Paul. I might call you that from now on. That could be quite a catchy nickname. Paul, you're going to explain a little bit about the UK bond. How does that work, and the key features of that for us?
Yeah. Thank you, Matt. Thank you for the intro. Yeah, a UK bond is essentially a single premium life insurance policy that can be used to hold investments in the UK in a very tax efficient manner. UK bonds come in different forms. There's an onshore option, which is the which can be used, but the preferred choice for many is the offshore version of the UK bond, which is established either in Ireland or in the Isle of Man, and where you benefit from minimal tax and allowing the investment returns to roll up gross with no tax deduction. In terms of the key features, Matt, I think one of the key features is, well, there's two things. You can have a UK bond on its own, or the UK bond can be settled in a trust, whether it's a discretionary trust or an absolute trust. There's other forms as well, like loan trusts, but it's outside the scope of this webinar to go into that level of detail. But the UK bond, one of the key benefits is that you can withdraw up to 5% of the initial premium or investment each year. So if you invest £1 million in a UK bond, you're allowed to take deferred income of 50,000 for 20 years, which would constitute return of capital with no immediate tax liability. That doesn't mean that you have to take 5% per annum religiously. You're allowed to carry forward any unutilized 5% allowance to future years. So for instance, if you never take deferred income in the first 4 years, at the end of year 4, you can take 4 times 5, you could take 20% of the initial premium tax-free in the UK with no problem. Now, gains from bonds are treated as savings income, and the tax treatment of bonds can be particularly advantageous for higher rate and non taxpayers alike, depending on their specific situation. So what are the key benefits? I always say there's 4 key benefits. One of the benefits is that it's not subject to capital gains tax. So your investments are rolling up free of capital gains over time without an immediate tax charge until such time as you withdraw more than the allowance of 5% per annum. That would make it, I think it's called a chargeable event, Matt?
Yeah, chargeable,
And
yeah.
A chargeable event. So yeah, it benefits from capital gains tax-free growth within the structure until a benefit is crystallized. Yeah, what I've just mentioned, flexible and deferred income stream of 5% per annum for 20 years until the initial capital has been repaid. Flexibility, because it hasn't got to be 5. You might defer it 1 or 2 years and then take a bit more. You might be taking 3% because you haven't got the income requirements for 5%. So you take 3 every year. That means that you have, effectively, rather than 20 years, you have more years of taking income in a tax deferred manner. And the third way that I think the UK bond is beneficial to someone who's UK tax resident is when you combine the UK bond by settling it in a trust, particularly in the discounted gift trust, or it could be a loan trust, because it effectively removes those assets from your UK estate for UK inheritance tax planning. So you can imagine you set up a UK bond, settle it in a trust, and you are drawing as a settlor, you're enjoying the income that it produces during your lifetime, and the residual value of the fund after 7 years becomes exempt of UK capital gains tax for the beneficiaries. So it's removed from your estate. Of course, your beneficiaries would then be subject to tax when the trust is dissolved or you are passing away, and it's assigned back to them as beneficiaries, and then they can withdraw either partially or fully based on the marginal rate of tax, or they could even assign segments to a third party. Yeah, so it provides a lot of different options within the policy. Yep, I think I've covered the fourth one. Is basically the assigning of policy segments to either a lower rate or a nil rate taxpayer, which I think can be a very clever way of mitigating tax. I'll give you an example. You set up the UK bond, you're living in the UK, your beneficiary is your son, Lucas, and you're drawing income during your lifetime. You pass away, and the UK bond is settled in a trust. When you pass away, the trust is dissolved and the policy is assigned to Lucas, to your son. He's the sole beneficiary, and then he can either draw income depending on his marginal rate of tax. So he's looking at his marginal rate and saying, I should take more or less, Or if he's got children or he's got someone he can assign, he could assign segments to someone. And again, and if it's a nil rate taxpayer, then there's no tax to pay. You removed the assets from your UK estate, Matt, and your son has inherited free of UK IHT, and then your son can in turn assign policy segments to a third party, which could be your grandchildren. Yeah, so I think it's a clever way of planning and reducing your tax exposure. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you,
Thank
Paul. Already considering how to give my wealth to my unborn grandchildren as well. That's
Exactly.
financial planning for you. Good. So we move on from the UK bond to the Portuguese bond. So we move from London to Lisbon, and let's see what the difference is there. And before I go into the bond, I think one thing to bear in mind is when we do move to a new country, there are huge differences in taxation and the way that's handled and dealt with, and the UK and Portugal is a very good example of that, and Portugal even more so, because in Portugal a lot of you will be familiar with the non-habitual residency scheme, which is 10 years of tax breaks, but you've also got a different taxation to deal with after those 10 years. So you've got really kind of 3 different taxations that you're comparing: the UK, the NHR, and then post NHR. And we have to remember then, when we exit the UK, financial products that we've used before, maybe such as the UK bond that Paul's mentioned, are an ISAs, which offer tax wrappers around assets. They're no longer valid. The tax advantages don't work in Portugal because they won't be compliant. And another thing to bear in mind as well, and I mentioned the NHR in Portugal, which is an incredible tax scheme, but the one thing that's overlooked by NHR is capital gains. Capital gains tax is 28% in Portugal, which is higher than most countries, including the UK. And whether you are inside NHR or outside, it's always 28%. So it's quite a high amount. There's no saving in NHR, so you have to make sure that you plan properly. And maybe this is where the Portuguese bond can come in. So what is it? I mean, it sounds very similar to the UK bond. It's a single premium investment linked life insurance policy, and it has to meet a number of technical conditions to be deemed tax compliant in bonds. So not every bond can be a Portuguese bond. It has to be set up properly and with these conditions met to be tax compliant in Portugal. But effectively, it's a lump sum investment that you can make and that you can top up later, that acts as and the bond acts as a wrapper around the assets held. And this allows the person holding the bond to invest in a very tax efficient way. They can grow their assets, and maybe they want to provide a regular income a bit further down the line. So what are the best features and the key benefits? So similar again to a UK bond, there's no immediate capital gains. So there's no capital gains or any tax until you make a withdrawal or surrender. So you invest your money into the Portuguese bond. This can grow with no capital gains applied to it, as normally would be in Portugal each year if it was outside of the bond wrapper. And then when you do make a withdrawal, only the gain element is liable for tax. And shortly I will kind of demonstrate how that works. And as part of this, the tax you pay reduces over time the longer you hold the bond. So this is a very important one. So capital gains is nearly always 28% in Portugal, but with the bond, and if you hold it for sufficient time, this reduces. So in years 1 to 4 is 28%. Years 5 to 7, it reduces down to 22.4%. And then year 8 onwards, the tax rate you pay is 11.2%. So that's 11.2% on the gain element of the withdrawal only. So I will demonstrate that shortly. And when the tax is calculated, this is done by the bond provider itself, and they pay their tax direct to the Portuguese tax authorities for you. So you make the withdrawal, they do the calculation, you receive the net payment, the tax is withheld, and that's paid for you to the tax authority. So it saves you from an admin point of view. It means your annual reporting is more simplified. Then any gains, dividends, and interest all within the bond, so these don't need to be reported. It's just that when you make the withdrawal. Another feature is that the policy can be written in joint names. So that means on first death, the bond can continue and just be passed into the name of the survivor, meaning there's no kind of lengthy, costly Portuguese probate, and there's no tax to pay. And then if you pass it on to your ultimate beneficiaries, as long as they're direct family members, these are out of the scope for Portuguese succession tax, or what they call stamp duty these days. And now, finally, with a Portuguese bond, you can invest in a wide range of funds. There are restrictions on that, which we'll explain later. They need to be what they call UCITS. But you can hold funds in the range of sterling, euros, US dollar. So you maybe got a broader range of funds and greater diversification than you would on a UK product. So I mentioned about the efficiency, the tax efficiency of the withdrawals. And let me just share my screen there. So I think you can see that diagram there. So this is a very simple example of how it works. So we're using an example of you make an investment of 100,000 euros. And then after 8 years, it's grown 50%. So it's now worth 150,000 euros. And so the bond provider is able to work out, okay, 100,000 of that is capital, 50,000 of that is growth. And you decide to make a surrender, which is 15,000 euros in this example. So again, they can calculate what element of that 15,000 is return of capital. So in this example, 10,000 euros. And what amount is gain? 5,000 euros. Then they apply the tax. And because you've held the bond for 8 years, that is only 11.2%. So again, it would normally be 28%, but because you've held the bond for that 8 years, it's 11.2%. So the calculation of the tax is only 560 euros, which is an effective tax rate of 3.73%. And the remainder, the 14,440, is paid to yourself. So I think you can see how that works. And okay, it's a very simple example, but it really shows off of the benefits of using the Portuguese compliant bond. So I think I've summarized the benefits nicely there, but Paul, what circumstances should somebody not be using a Portuguese bond?
Well, yeah, very good question. What we do find from time to time is that UK nationals try to have their UK bond, which is an offshore bond, and they think that it will be tax compliant in a third country, be that Spain or Portugal, right? And normally what they find is that it's non-compliant because each country has its own tax regime and every bond is specific to the country. The UK, I just explained how the bond works. You've explained the Portuguese bond. There's a Spanish bond. There's an Italian bond. There's virtually all kinds of bond, offshore bond, which are life insurance policies, which have been structured and made and approved in the country where it's issued, right? And very often people think that they can use a non-compliant bond, an offshore bond, which is non-Portuguese compliant, and that it will work just the same. And they make a big mistake. It could be seriously detrimental to their wealth. So with a, for example, with a non-compliant policy, one which is, for instance, a UK offshore investment bond, which is typically issued out of the Isle of Man or the Channel Islands, tax is paid every year on the growth of the policy, whether it is withdrawn or not. So when we talk about the Portuguese bond and having capital gains tax-free gross roll-up, only when it is in the Portuguese bond, in the right structure, in the right environment, right? Then so long as there's no withdrawals, it's accumulating free of capital gains. If you use a bond which is non-compliant, then that CGT protection is no longer in place. So don't use non-compliant bonds. Don't fall for the trap of going into of investing in a Portuguese bond, which is being locked into a lengthy term with penalties for early surrender, which can be as high as 10 years. Some advisory firms will promote the Portuguese bond, and they will apply early encashment charges because then they can take heavy initial upfront charges. So don't ever invest in a Portuguese bond if you're subject to early encashment charges, because it means you're paying more in establishment fees, and then the commissions are paid on day one to the advisor. And if you're locked in for 10 years and on year 3 you want to get out, it is you who is liable to the insurance company for the commissions which have already been paid to the advisor. So no lock-in periods, yeah? Thirdly, non-qualifying assets, avoid at all costs. I think you've mentioned that's mainly UCITS funds that are allowed, but holding non-qualifying assets within the policy may invalidate the life contract. Don't be encouraged to invest in esoteric funds with promises of exceptional returns, because that's one sure way of losing the tax benefits as well as losing your capital. So that would be my third and my third point. Do I have more? Yes, I have 2 quick points. Do not combine your Portuguese bond with the QROPs. So if you're transferring your UK pension benefits into a qualifying recognized overseas pension scheme, there's no reason why you should house the UK pension benefits inside the Portuguese bond, which is in turn is settled inside the QROPs, inside the trust arrangement. That is just another extra layer of unnecessary costs, adds absolutely no value, and only benefits the financial advisory firm that is setting it up. And probably my last point, Matt, concerns the investment period. We do not believe that an individual should invest in a Portuguese bond if they intend to draw income in the first 8 years. It doesn't mean they cannot. I think you've already demonstrated that depending on how long they've kept it for before they make a withdrawal, you know, the tax falls over time. And after year 8, it's when it's at its most tax efficient, right? And in the example you gave, you know, that the rate of tax, the effective rate of tax is into single digits, which is ideally what you want to do. So if the intention is to establish a Portuguese bond and then make withdrawals from day one, there might be a better route to market. In other words, there could be another investment which gives you the instant access without having having to wait 8 years to obtain that tax efficiency. So, you know, when it comes to making decisions, you have to weigh things and say, okay, do I need instant accessibility, or is this something that I can park for 80 years to optimize my tax position by investing in this Portuguese bond structure, life policy, whatever you want to call it, or is there an alternative to that which gives me instant access and a much lower rate of tax? I mean, those are the kind of value judgments you need to make, and you need to consider what the options are. There's no one single route to market. Yeah, when it comes to restructuring your financial affairs in Portugal, there's different options, and it could even be a combination of.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good way of putting it, Paul, and I think that's what we see from our experience as well. The Portuguese bond can be a good solution for some people, but it's, your situation needs to be assessed, and everyone has a different situation, and if you've got someone just saying it has to be the bond for you without knowing your background, then they are just trying to push a product rather than giving you a solution. So as we said at the start of this webinar, the bond here is we're focusing the webinar on these products to give the information. Is it necessarily the right thing for you watching? It might be, it might not be, but you only know through a conversation with a trusted advisor who can kind of guide you through the process, and that's what we're here for. So we have a few frequently asked questions that have been submitted that we receive through, and it looks like, you know, a lot of that you've covered before, Paul, but I think some of it's worth kind of reiterating. So, you know, that question, how long will I be tied into the bond? So you have two options here. You can, and the bond can be set up in two ways. It can be set up, there's a large upfront hidden commission, and you are tied into the bond for 5, 7, maybe up to 10 years. You can pay a fully disclosed fee and not be tied into the bond. So it's a very simple decision, really. Do you want to pay more upfront and be tied in for longer? Or you want to pay less upfront and not be tied in? It always has to be the latter. And what we would say, if you are in conversations with someone and the advisor is even suggesting using what is called the commission route, which is this upfront where you're tied in, if they are even suggesting that as a route for you, and I've spoken to people before, and I think you have as well, Paul, and they've been told by these advisors that, oh, you don't have to pay for the bond, the bond provider are paying us, which is, of course, absolute rubbish, because the bond provider will be then taking the money from you, and that's why you're tied in. So if there's even a suggestion of using that route, we would say avoid those people. Okay, can I hold any assets within the bond? Well, we've mainly covered that. They need to be UCITS funds, which covers a majority of funds these days, and the UCITS is a kind of regulatory framework that is set up so cross-European funds can be used. But again, yeah, care has to be taken there, because if you hold non-qualifying assets, that may invalidate the contract, and therefore any tax advantages are completely lost. And the final one, can Fiduciary Wealth arrange everything for us? So the answer to that is yes. I mean, we're not the bond provider ourselves. That's not our business. We are the advisors, and we can walk you through the process. But these bonds are only available via financial intermediaries such as us. And as we say before, it's not a case of saying, okay, you need a bond, you should have a bond, you have a bond. No, let's have a conversation with you. Let's assess your situation. You tell us what you're looking to achieve, and then we can see if it's the most suitable product for you. So we're towards the end here, Paul. Before we go, is there any last advice that you think you should give anyone considering one of these products?
Yeah. A couple of things. I think the first thing is to establish whether the Portuguese bond is the right product for you. Very often you will find that that's the only product that some financial advisory firms will sell to you, regardless of whether it's the right one or not. So find out if there are alternatives to consider, or whether you can combine two different products to give you a better outcome. You don't have to be pushed towards in one direction. I think the second thing is ask your financial advisor to provide you with a letter-headed paper signed by two principals or directors of the firm, confirming that your advisor is a salaried employee rather than a commission-only advisor. I think that's really, really important, Matt, for the reasons we've touched upon in respect of the early encashment charges. Yeah, I think once an individual is on commission only, his ability to offer impartial advice is severely compromised, because they have to hunt to eat, and that means that they will try and sell, and for the highest commission as well, because that's their only and sole source of income. So doing your due diligence and asking the firm to confirm, letterheaded paper to directors, not the individual concerned, confirming that they're not salaried, that they are, that they're not commission only, but that they are salaried employees. I think that would give you a bit of reassurance. I think, again, covering the same ground, Matt, I think an individual should tell their advisors that if they were to invest in the Portuguese bond, they do not want to be subject to early encashment charges. They don't want to be tied in for any length of period. And again, they should ask for a letter signed by 2 directors confirming that confirming how much they're charging for establishing a Portuguese bond, and that it won't be subject to early encashment. Again, just doing little things to protect the individual's position and make sure that they are not taken advantage of. And the EU directives in place governing disclosure of fees and charges for non-insurance business. It's MiFID, which stands for Markets in Financial Instruments Directive, EU directive, which Portugal has to comply with. And for insurance-based products like a Portuguese bond, they would fall under the IDD directive, which is the old IMD, which was Insurance Mediation Directive. All fees and charges should be disclosed in terms of business, in the letter of advice when it's issued. And additionally, I would ask them the questions that I've just said, letter-headed paper signed by 2 directors. Then I think you know what you're getting into, and you're not going into a product blindfolded completely, and you're just taking the word of someone you've met recently.
Perfect. Yeah, and just to add to that, and we mentioned about this commission only kind of sales structure, because we've seen what they do before, and we have to warn people, and it's not only that their ability to be independent is flawed because they want to take the highest charge and therefore the product that goes with it, but also if you've got someone taking that high upfront, their ongoing service isn't available to you, and it's not just about setting up the product right, it's not just about establishing the right products for you, is about the ongoing management of the investments within it, because you need to ensure that they're growing in value for you. And if you've got someone who's taken a large upfront commission and that's it, well, they're going to sell the product to you and then move on to the next guy. So that's why we always kind of stress the importance of that. So we reached the end of the webinar. No questions for us today, Paul. Is that a relief or are you disappointed?
Do I have to answer the question?
Well, that's the only question we've got. So you can choose to.
I'm going to take the Fifth Amendment.
They plead the fifth, don't they? Okay, yeah. We'll allow that for today only. So everybody, thank you for either joining us today or watching this on the recording. The last thing we would say is, look, if you're on our YouTube channel, or if you're not, please visit and like, share, and subscribe to our videos. There's more webinars and podcasts on its way. And for those who are in the process of relocating or are already living abroad and you're interested to see how we can help you, feel free to reach out. Our website is fiduciarywealth.gi. Other than that, we say thank you for joining us or watching us today, and we will speak to some of you soon. So thank you and goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.